Welcome to The Hypnotist, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. Brought to you by the hypnotherapist demanded by celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, Adam Cox. These recordings took place live from Adam's clinic in London's world-famous Harley Street. This podcast features powerful hypnosis, so do not listen while driving or operating machinery. This recording is not suitable for those with epilepsy or severe mental health issues. So, get yourself comfortable and enjoy today's episode of The Hypnotist.
Hi, it's Adam here, and in this episode of The Hypnotist, you're not going to be listening to a hypnosis session. You're actually going to be listening to a presentation that I am rehearsing for the UK Hypnosis Conference, or the UK Hypnosis Convention, that takes place between the 15th and the 17th of November. And my talk is going to be on the power of podcasting aimed at an audience of therapists. And what I like to do when I've not done a presentation on a particular topic before is to get it out there in the world, because it does two things. One, it enables me to hear feedback from other people. And secondly, I listen to it as if I'm listening to it, as if someone else is presenting it. And that actually gives me a sense of perspective and insight so I can make changes if needed. So this is designed to be an hour presentation, but because it was done on YouTube Live, some references are to being watched or viewed, and obviously it's designed to be presented to a physical audience, so some of the interaction elements won't quite make sense. But I'm putting this out there for two reasons. One, not everyone listening is UK based, and even if you are UK based, you're probably not guaranteed to be able to be at the UK Hypnosis Convention. I would encourage you, if you are UK based, to consider going to the UK Hypnosis Convention, because it's a very good convention to get access to lots of leading minds in the world of hypnosis in a very condensed period of time. So if you are interested in hypnosis, please check out the website link I'm going to put in the show notes for the UK Hypnosis Convention, and I have a code which gives you a discount for tickets as well. So if that's of interest, check that out. If you're normally interested more of my hypnosis sessions, maybe this is one to skip. But if you are interested in launching your own podcast, it's worth bearing in mind for two reasons. One, there's a lot of information shared in this kind of 50 minutes or so. But secondly, I do have an online course that I created with the details, with the actual mechanics of how to launch a podcast and how to do that. And if that's of interest, I'll put the link in the show notes as well. For now, find a quiet, comfortable place and enjoy this presentation. Okay, so we should be live. I'm hoping we're live, and probably makes sense for me to explain what I'm actually doing here. So this is a presentation that I'm going to be hosting at the UK Hypnosis Conference. And what I quite like to do before I do a presentation that I've never actually done before is to do a practice one. So this is a practice one to a live audience, which may or may not be there, just so I can get used to going through the presentation to an audience, so I can get my head in the right kind of structure, so I can make any changes. And what I would really start by saying is this is for people working in the wellness industry, in the therapy industry. Maybe you're a therapist, a counselor, a psychologist, could be a hypnotherapist. And this presentation is all going to be about how podcasting can actually give a lot of value, particularly if you're a therapist. And I'm going to be going through this presentation. Obviously, the presentation itself is designed to be presented in person rather than individually. And I'm saying that knowing that the very next slide is actually more of an interactive raise your hand kind of slide. So not all of the slides are going to make sense. Some of it presupposes some kind of interaction. But I'm going to go through this anyway, because first and foremost, it's for me to practice the content, so I've got a feedback loop to refine it. The other thing I would say is that if you are based in the UK, the UK Hypnosis Conference is by far the best conference in the UK for hypnotherapists. It takes place from the 15th to the 17th of November. So at the point where I'm recording this, it's perhaps 2 weeks away, 2.5 weeks away. So if you like the idea of learning a lot about hypnotherapy in a short period of time, and sometimes people ask me, they say, like, where's the best place to learn about hypnosis, or learn hypnosis techniques, or learn some of the things related to the industry? And there are great academies out there. I think the Mike Mandel Academy is great. I think the Jack Wynn's Academy is great. You've got lots of other trainers out there like Carl Smith, and you've got people that have these kind of online or in-person courses. They're great. What you get from a conference, and that conference could be the UK Hypnosis Conference in London, for example, in a few weeks' time. It could be the world's biggest hypnosis conference, which is Hypnothoughts Live in Vegas in July. It could be the Irish Hypnotherapy Conference in April. Within the space of about 2 days or 3 days, you're getting a lot of very, very experienced therapists sharing their insights, sharing their experience in a condensed period of time. So I would say if you're planning on learning more about hypnosis, these conferences are a great place to go. And the other thing that I would say about the UK Hypnosis Conference specifically is that because I'm speaking at the UK Hypnosis Conference, I think the code is ADAMC. So if you use ADAMC when booking your UK Hypnosis Conference ticket, you will get a discount. And that discount enables you to potentially have some extra money for drinks or food while you're there. You get exactly the same thing, you just get it at a discount, and that is ADAMC as the discount code. And I'll put a link in the YouTube notes, and if this goes out on my podcast, I'll put a link there in the show notes as to how to book tickets for the UK Hypnosis Conference. I'll be doing a 1-hour talk. Originally, it was scheduled to be a 30-minute talk, but I spoke to the organizer and they've said, look, could you make it an hour talk? And that's actually a relief for me, because I was wondering how I would squeeze in everything that I want to say about podcasting in 30 minutes. So it's going to be an hour talk at the UK Hypnosis Conference on the Saturday. So if you're only going to the conference for one day, why not go on the Saturday? It's the best day. Plus, I'll be there and you can watch my talk. That said, let's carry on with the presentation. So, and this again assumes a live audience. Raise your hand if you have listened to a podcast. Raise your hand if you've listened to my podcast. Raise your hand if you listen regularly to a podcast. And again, if you have no interest in podcasts at all. And if you have no interest in podcasts at all, in all honesty, this probably isn't the presentation for you unless you want it to create a spark of interest in podcasts. Raise your hand if you've been on a podcast. And finally, raise your hand if you host a podcast. And I say finally, there is one final thing. Raise your hand if you want to host a podcast, because a lot of the value that you're going to get from this presentation today is going to be if you want to be a guest on people's podcasts, or you want to host a podcast, or you want to improve a podcast that you already host. And if that sounds like you, you're certainly in the right place. So a bit about me. I accidentally became a podcaster. And I accidentally became a podcaster because I accidentally became a radio presenter. And this is going back about 6 years ago. There was a radio station in London called Share Radio. And I had heard that they had great studios that weren't being used all the time. And I reached out to the radio station because at the time we were hiring a lot of studios in central London. And I wanted to figure out if it could be a studio that we could use to do broadcast interviews. So I turned up at the radio station, had a look at the studio, and it was quite obvious that it wasn't quite right to have a spokesperson linking up to lots of different radio stations. But it did look like it would be a great studio for podcast style interactions. And it was Share Radio, and the managing director took me out for lunch, and we were just kind of discussing different things. And he said, look, clearly the studios aren't right for you, but if you want to record some kind of a podcast here, we'll either give you preferential rates, or if you can use the content also for our radio station, then we won't charge you anything for the studio. And that was said, and about 2 weeks later, there was a company who had a spokesperson, and this was a real cybersecurity expert. And this cybersecurity expert was talking about how hackers were using things like greed and curiosity and guilt and fear to initiate phishing attacks where they steal your details. They rush you into putting your password into a fake page, and then they've captured your details, and then they either sell them or use them for other things. So this was an interaction, and I hosted that conversation, and we were talking, and I've got an interest in psychology and how people think, and it was a good conversation, and it lasted about 15 minutes. And a few days later, the radio station said, that was great. It's gone out on the radio station. When's the next episode? And at that point, I had no intention of having a radio show, but they liked the content and they wanted more of it. So very quickly, I had to come up with a name of the show. I had to come up with some kind of a concept. And the concept that I liked, because I was interested in NLP from years and years before, is this idea of modeling, of picking the brains of people that do certain things very well. So I thought, okay, a great name could be Modern Mindset. And the idea is to pick the brains of people with, elicit their strategies, their beliefs, and those kind of things. So we did, but I didn't have any guests. But luckily, I knew lots of people from the world of personal development, and I asked all these people that I knew to come on my show. And I was doing one episode every week for about a year. And then I ran into a former employee of mine, a guy called James Burt, who was obsessive about podcasts, still is. Very good person to speak to if you're interested in launching your own podcast. And he sold me on the idea of podcasts. And he said, well, look, all of these radio shows that you've been doing for the last kind of year or so, where's the audio? And all of the audio was saved. None of it was lost. And he said, well, look, you could launch a podcast already with hundreds of episodes. So I did. And it was Modern Mindset. And in February 2020, Modern Mindset as a podcast went live. And it did okay. And interestingly, the radio station downsized. The radio station still exists. They just don't have those lovely studios. So it kind of meant that I had to build my own studio to continue with the content. So Modern Mindset still exists. I think I'm on about episode 520 at this point. But my real passion wasn't interviewing people about different areas of kind of psychology. My real passion is hypnotherapy. So having had that radio show for a couple of years and then a podcast for a month, the idea dawned on me, particularly at the point where COVID was coming in, there was a lockdown. I'd already stepped away from my clinic in Harley Street. I thought, I need an outlet for my creativity and my hypnotherapy. And I thought of this idea of a podcast called The Hypnotist. Now, there's a couple of things to share with you here. First, the name The Hypnotist. I'd love to say it was my idea for the show. It wasn't. I was listening to another hypnosis podcast that I love called Brain Software with Mike Mandel. And on one of those episodes, they interview Anthony Jacquin. And in the book, Reality is Plastic, Anthony was talking about how if you're a hypnotist, you can't just be a hypnotist, you have to be the hypnotist. And the moment I heard that, it really resonated. And this was months before I launched the podcast. But because I had heard that, then I was thinking of a hypnosis podcast. I thought, what a great title. And I checked if anyone else had a podcast of that title. Nobody did, so I took it. And the other thing, the inspiration for the concept was when I got into hypnosis, the kind of books that I loved reading was transcripts of real hypnosis interactions or real NLP interactions. So some of the transcripts of Milton Erickson, and there's a great book called Magic in Action where you've got early Richard Bandler interactions using these NLP techniques. And I found that way more interesting, the actual interaction between people, than a step-by-step guide to a protocol or a script. So those things collided, and I thought, what if, rather than a training hypnosis podcast like Brain Software, and rather than these YouTube channels where they clearly have scripted hypnosis sessions, what if I have the premise that it is real hypnosis with real clients facing real issues, and you get to hear not the client, but my hypnosis that I did with them while protecting the confidentiality of the client. And that's really the concept. Now, what was interesting is that when I published the first episode of the Hypnotist podcast, some of you might be familiar with a character called Jonathan Chase. And Jonathan Chase, years before, had a radio show that he called The Hypnotist, and he was convinced that I stole his idea. So instead of us squabbling online, I invited him to be a guest on Modern Mindset, and we just talked for about 45 minutes. And I told him where I got the idea. And when I told him that, Anthony Jacquin was talking about it in his book, he smiled, giving me a clue that maybe Anthony had got that idea inspired from someone else as well. So that's where it came from. And that was about 4.5 years ago. So it's been going for a while now. This is the intro to the video version of the podcast. There's a couple of things to share there. One is that clearly that is a lot of branding. Hypnotherapists to celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, this kind of media appearances. A lot of it is just the prestige. And I'm sure you've heard about this from other hypnotherapists, is that the prestige is a vital toolkit in the armory of a hypnotist. It's the same reason that there are letters after a name or certificates in the wall behind the therapist, is to give a sense of prestige and credibility. And that's what I use my media appearances and a third-party voiceover to give a level of prestige. And all of that is true, by the way. I would say I'm the UK's leading hypnotherapist. From a podcasting perspective, my audience is higher than any other hypnotherapist that I know. And from the basis of, I definitely have worked with CEOs and celebrities, and the royalty isn't the royalty that you see in that picture, but I'm not saying it is, but I have worked with members of royalty. So all of that adds to this element of credibility and prestige. This slide here is designed to manage expectations and show what's possible. And what I like about this is that, yes, I'm approaching 10 million downloads in total. But what I want you to see is that this little box here that says on May the 5th, and bearing in mind that the podcast had been going live for about a month at that point, on May the 5th, there were no downloads whatsoever, not one. And I think a lot of people would have given up. if they're like, well, why am I spending all this time recording podcasts and publishing podcasts if I'm not getting any listeners? Well, what's really interesting is that within a few weeks, it was in the tens, and then it was in the hundreds, and now it's over 10,000 a day on average. But that came from the consistency of doing it on a regular basis. And every now and then you get these anomalies, you get these little kind of blips where someone somewhere, with a big following has shared it, and then you get all of this kind of stuff. What really helped me to kind of really build an audience, it was lockdown, I was bored, I was watching lots of movies at the time, and one of them was Limitless, and I created a hypnosis session inspired by the storyline of the Limitless film, the one with Bradley Cooper and Robert De Niro, and then that had a spike, and then I did one based on Inception, and a few of the books like The Richest Man in Babylon and The Alchemist, and again it started to grow. So when I added creativity, the audience grows. But I say this because you can build an audience, but don't expect that you're going to have a massive audience on day one. It's something that you build, and therefore I feel like it's really important that I let you know that that's the case. The exception to that is if you're already a big follower, if you're a celebrity, if you've got a big following already, well, then you're going to get a big audience. Cristiano Ronaldo just recently launched a YouTube channel, and it's already got millions of subscribers because he's well known and he already has an audience. And if that's you, then you can launch a podcast and have millions of followers straight away. But if nobody knows you yet, you've really got to build the audience. This slide here shows that actually over time you can become globally recognized. So you'll see me here in the Spotify charts. This is the Apple charts, and pretty much every day for the last 3 years or so, I'm constantly in some chart, and it fluctuates, it changes up and down. But there are people around the world that know me as the hypnotist for them. To them, I'm more well known than a Paul McKenna, or a Richard Bandler or a Marissa Peer. Like, they know me better than they know them because they're listening to my stuff all the time. So it has that ability to really build an audience. So why podcasting is a very obvious question. You get reach and the ability to influence, and those figures can be huge. They can be massive. You can build an audience of people that listen to you. Spotify have this thing called Spotify Wrapped. It really gets released every late November. And last year, for over 23,000 people, I was the podcast they listened to more than any other podcast. That is huge levels of influence that I would not have got were it not for podcasting. You get to build trust and authority, like genuine levels of trust and authority. You're seen as an expert. You're seen as someone trustworthy, and you're building this real relationship with them. It gives you global exposure for your niche. For me, it's hypnotherapy, but this same structure would work for any therapeutic niche. You get global exposure, and there are my client base before COVID, because I was based in Harley Street, was very much limited to a 30 or 40 mile radius of London. Because I have a studio and I do most of my sessions online, now my audience is genuinely around the world. I've got more clients from countries like the States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Arab Emirates than I do in the UK now. And that's because of the global exposure that I have from podcasting. One of the great things about podcasts is that you can have a link in the show notes, and the algorithm doesn't punish you for having a link. So for acquiring leads, it's great. And there's certain things that I do to turn my podcast audience into leads. I offer free downloads, and in return, they give me their email address, so I'm building email addresses. But I also have a link to book a free consultation call in the show notes, and I mention it before my podcast episode so that people can book a free consultation call. And because of that, a lot of my clients and new clients come from my podcast. And these are, I think, 5 very good reasons as to why podcasting. So let's talk a little bit about the numbers. In the States, which is the most developed podcast audience, 80% are familiar with podcasts, 62% have listened to a podcast, and 26% listen to podcasts every single week. This was 2022, and it's certainly grown since then. Monthly podcast listeners, again, the bigger audience is younger. It drops off as people get older because it involves technology. It generally involves using a smartphone. But again, these are growing. And the most popular podcast genres, comedy, news, and true crime are at the top. But have a look at this. Health and fitness, 17%, not far off the top, and self-help at 15%. And I would say hypnotherapy and therapy sits within that. And if you recall that Spotify chart, I was at 29 in the health and fitness chart, not in the self-help chart. So, I would say a lot of what people are looking for from their podcast is exactly the thing that we have to offer. But we're in the UK, so let's talk about some UK facts. 61% of the UK listen to podcasts. 76% of 18 to 34-year-olds are podcast listeners. So if your niche targets people under the age of 34 or 35 or under, then your audience is listening to podcasts, and therefore you've got a great way of communicating with them. 58% are male and 42% are female. I can tell you from the analytics of people that listen to my show, it's very different. Around about 2/3 are female and 1/3 is male. So even though this is how many people are listening to podcasts, your actual listeners will depend on your niche. Mine tend to be more likely to be female and more likely to be 35 and older because that's who likes my content. And when you create a podcast, if you do, maybe your audience will be different. You will resonate with a different audience. Podcast listeners in the UK mostly listen alone. 94%. It's not a shared activity. People generally watch TV or movies with people. Podcast listeners is a solitary activity, and they often listen while they're at home. And I can tell you this again from my podcast numbers. A lot of people listen to my stuff just before they go to sleep. They're listening to me right before they go to sleep and they're in bed. And therefore that creates a unique connection that they're literally hearing my voice right before they sleep, gives them a feeling of familiarity. And we know as hypnotherapists that rapport is one of the most important things. And therefore, there's that rapport already there. They have rapport with my voice and the essence of me, even before they ever consider working with me. 3/4 listen on smartphones, and about 70% of podcast listeners listen to an entire episode. I think this is very useful. It's important to know that people are listening to podcasts, and these are real people, and you've got the ability to create something that connects with these people. So how do they get to learn about you? If you were to consume a podcast, where would you find it? And I would say there's 3 key places where people get their podcasts. Apple Podcast is just the biggest slightly right now. Spotify is the second, and podcasts on YouTube is number 3. For me, I can tell you it's the different sequence. I get most of my audience from Spotify. And again, different content. There are different algorithms on these platforms enable you to find different audiences. And some people like my voice, some people don't like my voice. It's totally fine. This is the great benefit of there being so much content is that people find the therapist or the style of content or the tonality that they resonate with, and if they like it, they'll become a listener, and if they don't, they'll find someone else. And that's one of the great things. So if you want to find podcasts, I would say go on Spotify, go on Apple Podcasts, or go on YouTube. And in fact, you could do this now. If you open up your smartphone and go into, some of these are already on there. So you go to Spotify, for example, and if you just put hypnosis in the podcast section, it's highly likely you're going to see my content. If you put the title, The Hypnotist, you'll definitely see my content on any of these platforms. And what I use to distribute is I don't use the platforms directly. I use a podcast distribution software called Libsyn, and I pay a small fee per month, and then it means I get to be on all of the podcast platforms. So that's useful to know if you want to be efficient and cover more ground. So be a guest on other people's podcast. And, we've got some faces here. Some of you might know them, but a good example of let's say, more of a clinical psychologist more than a therapist. But if you think of Jordan Peterson, it was his media appearances, particularly on podcasts like Joe Rogan, that really elevated his brand positioning. So I would encourage you to reach out to podcast hosts and become a guest. You're going to understand podcasts a lot more if you are featured on podcasts. Here's a few people, therapists that have been on my podcast. So you've got Sheila Granger there, and we were having a great chat about, this was in COVID, about hypnotic vacations, that people couldn't actually travel in reality, but they could travel in their imagination. You've got Professor Gordon Emerson there, one of the influential figures, originally in ego state therapy and now resource state therapy. And we had a great chat about the function of these resource states and how you can harness these resource states. We've got Stephen Blake there. He was a guest on my show, and we were talking about chronic pain and how clients can let go of chronic pain if it no longer serves them, and the right metaphors and approaches for that. Actually, in that session, I had a gym injury on my shoulder, and Stephen actually did Old Pain to Go protocol with me, and you can actually find that episode on my podcast. If you look for Old Pain to Go and The Hypnotist, you'll find that episode. And you've got Gary Coles there, and we're having a great conversation about hypnosis for oncology and cancer patients and all the things that it's useful for. And these were 4 great conversations. And it was good content for my podcast, but it was also good because these people were communicating with me while also accessing an audience of people interested in therapy and wellness and mental health. And that's the key to being a guest on other people's podcasts. It has to be a genuine win-win. So tips to be a podcast guest. First of all, research relevant podcasts. There is a search engine I use a lot called listennotes.com. And if you go on listennotes.com, you can research any podcast. And some of them you can research by category or title or sector. And also go on the platforms, go on Spotify, go on Apple and listen to these, look in the charts. So research the relevant podcasts. Craft a strong pitch. Pitch is a PR, kind of phrase, PR terminology. It just means what is your reason? And that might be an email or it might be a verbal thing, but you want to make it a win-win. Why is it good for the show? Why is it good for you? But really think in terms of them. Why would you be a good guest to be on their show? What can you talk about? Leverage previous media appearances. So I've got 3 TV clips here. These aren't podcasts. I've been on lots of podcasts, but these are 3 TV clips. I have them on the front page of my website because TV, radio, and podcasts feel more comfortable inviting you on their show if they've seen that you've already done this stuff on other people's show. So whenever you get any media appearances, don't just get the media appearances, leverage the media appearances. And you can leverage them if you're reaching out to podcast hosts, because you can send a link to these kind of clips, and that's going to give them a sense of confidence, but it's also going to enable them to see how you come across. And if they like how you come across, well, don't be surprised if they invite you on the show. Offer a unique angle. Now, this relates back to the pitch. Your angle is, what are you going to talk about? And sometimes you can come up with things that are timely. I recently did a Halloween-themed hypnosis podcast. I remember doing content around tocophobia, which is this fear of pregnancy when there were some high-profile royal pregnancies. So come up with an angle, come up with some kind of thing that would be beneficial so that the podcast host or the producer wants to have you on the show. And engage with the podcast host before pitching. So if the very first, I get emails all the time, people wanting to be on my podcast, and they're going straight in with the pitch. But they haven't listened to anything that I've done, or they're pretending to have listened to stuff that I've done. They don't really know the format. They've not engaged with me on social media. And a lot of the guests that I've actually had, I talk to them at conferences, I get to know them, and they talk about something interesting. And I'm like, oh yeah, I could see that working. So they're kind of engaging with me before they pitch to be on my show. And I would encourage you to do the same. So engage with podcast hosts before you pitch. Okay. This is what a lot of people think being a podcast host is, particularly a therapy-based podcast. And look, there's some truth to it. You might need a microphone, you might need a computer, this audio editing stuff. So now we're getting on to not so much being a guest on a podcast, but hosting your own podcast. And again, just raise your hand if you're curious or interested in being a podcast host or improving your podcast if you already have one. Okay, great to see. So first of all, where it really starts is creating an interesting concept. Now, the term broadcast applies to radio and TV, and broadcast has this idea that you're broadcasting, you're communicating with a big audience. Podcasts used to be called narrowcast, and that means that the expectation is that they're smaller, more targeted audiences, and therefore that helps you to come up with a plan, and that is, the goal is to aim to be a niche podcast. That if you aim to be a general podcast talking about anything, people don't know why they should listen. Now, it was fine to be a general podcast 10 years ago, but there's too many podcasts now. So aim to be a niche. You want to be the best in a particular category, and that will help you to build an audience. And you need to know your audience's needs. What is it that they want? What is it that they need? Is it information? Is it education? Is it to experience hypnosis? Do they want to know how to sleep better? Do they want to release anxiety? Know your audience's needs. Embrace authenticity and vulnerability. And I would say that if you try and put on a fake voice, if you try and come across like you know everything, actually you're going to break rapport with your audience. You're going to create a feeling of disingenuineness. So be yourself, talk how you normally talk, be enthusiastic, be confident, but putting on a radio voice, isn't going to help. Putting on a hypnosis voice isn't really going to help. So yeah, really important to kind of think that through. Educate through storytelling. If you're being a preacher and if you're telling people what they should be doing or all this kind of stuff, it's not going to come across the same way that if you're telling a story. And a lot of my hypnosis sessions that I do use metaphor, and they use storytelling, and they use nested loops, because I find that it becomes more interesting and engaging for the audience if it's told through a story than if it is just completely technique based, or if I'm just trying to educate them on a particular problem, much better to educate through storytelling. Consistency is really, really important. You want to have the same theme, the same format, and ideally the same frequency. Offer practical takeaways. What is it that they can do? What is it that they can change? Quite often in the intro bit before my episode, I give them tips on how they can make the hypnosis session more relevant for them or more empowering for them by thinking of a goal or linking it to a problem or thinking about something they want to change beforehand. So really make it practical and beneficial, and use simple language. The goal here isn't to come across as intelligent and to use flowery language. Use the language that makes it accessible to as many people as you can, and that can be quite helpful. The final thing on this bit is to prioritize quality and consistency over perfection. Because if you try and make everything perfect, what you'll find is that you don't publish enough episodes. And it is better to have a good microphone and deliver on a consistent basis than try and do too much. Considerations. Right, title of your show. You need to check it's available. Again, listennotes.com is where you can do that. It isn't the end of the world if someone already has your podcast title. There is nothing to stop you having the same title as someone else. It just doesn't make sense to do that if they're still running that show. If they had that title a few years ago and they haven't done an episode for ages, by all means, do that. My first podcast, Modern Mindset, there was already a podcast called Modern Mindset, but there wasn't a podcast called Modern Mindset with Adam Cox. So make it slightly different so people know where to find it. You're going to need artwork for the podcast in general, and some people like to have individual artwork for each episode. You get to choose that, but you're definitely going to need artwork for that. AI can create the artwork for you, or you can use a designer, as I used a designer for mine, and you can find them pretty cheap on places like Fiverr. You need to think, are you going to be the host and interview people, or are you going to be a solo host, or are you going to have a different format? Is it going to be like 3 or 4 of you? It's like a panel, there's some kind of interactive discussion. These are things to consider before you launch your podcast. How often will you publish? My advice would be to start with something you can stick to. It's better to do an episode every 2 weeks and then increase that to weekly than to start weekly and then have a few weeks where you don't have any content. So frequency, how often will you publish, and then be consistent with that. Is it just going to be audio, or is it going to be video too? And if it's video too, well, then you're going to need some more equipment, and we'll talk about that soon. But these are the kind of things to think about. And is it going to be pre-recorded or live? Now, interestingly, the podcast bit tends to have to be pre-recorded, just based on how you publish the actual audio. It can be live on YouTube though, and it can be live on other platforms. Maybe you publish live on YouTube Live, or use something like StreamYard to be on Facebook and Instagram, and then you capture the audio, and then the audio goes out later. So it can be pre-recorded or live or both. It can't be exclusively live if you also want to be on things like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And repurposing content. Is your plan to repurpose content or just do the podcast and nothing else? And I'm going to share some ideas about how you can repurpose content later on today. And you also need to think about introductions and your outro. What's that first 30 seconds going to sound like, and what's your final 30 seconds? I like to do music-based introductions voiced over by someone else, because then you get that third-party introduction rather than it just goes straight into the thing. It gives it an element of prestige and priming that you don't get if you just go straight into the podcast. And the outro can be a great way to encourage people to give you a rating, a review, or to share your content with other people. And are you going to have an offer or call to action? In most of my podcasts, my offer or call to action is to say, look, if you're curious to work with me, book a free consultation call, and that could be enough. So just think, and you don't have to have that, but you just can have that. And finally, are you going to monetize or not? My advice would be that you monetize, but in an interesting way. You want to monetize through the acquisition of new clients or through selling digital products, not by having adverts on your content. If you have adverts on your content, one, you're not going to be paid very much. And secondly, it's going to interrupt the experience, particularly if it's a hypnosis session. Nobody wants to hear an advert right in the middle of that. And I learned this brutally on my podcast channel because my virtual assistant selected mid-roll ads, which basically means adverts come up in the middle of the content rather than just right at the beginning and right at the end. And people were furious, rightly so, because right in the middle of a hypnosis session, they get interrupted. It breaks rapport. It knocks them out of wherever they are at that point in time into horrible experience. So my advice would be to, if you are going to monetize, make sure the adverts are before and after the show, not in the middle, but ideally monetize through the acquisition of new clients. Right. This is a picture of my studio. You don't need a studio like this. You just could have a studio like this. And there's certain essential kit. So you need a microphone. This microphone here, the black one, is, I call it the Joe Rogan mic. It's the Shure SM7B. It's a great microphone, but I've got this USB, it's called the Rode Podcaster mic, and I have it there because for the first year and a half, that was the microphone I used for my podcast. It's a great mic. It's a USB mic, and it only costs about £120 on Amazon. And I would encourage you probably to start with that and only get a more expensive mic if you're really committed to the show. You're probably going to need some kind of editing software. You can get free editing software like Audacity. That would be my recommendation. And or you can pay a lot for software. You can get things like Adobe Audition, but you probably will need some form of editing software and a quiet space. It doesn't need to be a studio. It could just be a spare room. And these, I would say, are the essential things that you're going to need, and probably some kind of computer to record it on. What's optional is this kind of mixing desk. This is the Rodecaster Pro 2. It is a great bit of kit, but it's optional. You don't actually need that. Sound effects or background music. You see these colorful tiles here. They actually play theta wave music, so I can do the session for my client, record the audio with the music bed already on there, and then it means the client gets the experience and I get the audio, which needs very little editing. And a video camera as well. Most of my hypnosis sessions comes from real client sessions, so the clients see me doing the hypnosis, but it also means that I can record additional content from that. And you can see these acoustic foam tiles here. These are designed to reduce echo, and the little foam mic shield here is certain words that have P's and T's and S's give a burst of air into the microphone, so that kind of screens out. It's called a pop shield or a pop. Pop shield is the thing. Is the popping of the voice. Before we end, I wanted to do a couple of things. One, this is a concept that I had for a podcast that I have not used. The nearest I've got to it is something I called random hypnosis, where I had these random generators and I had to kind of create a real on-the-spot hypnosis session in real time from these random things. But I had an idea called hypnotic dice, and the idea would be that you have 6 or 7 different colored dice, and each color represents a different variable that changes, and then you roll the dice, and depending on the number, that creates some kind of hypnosis session you do in real time. I had the idea, I did nothing with it. If you like that idea, feel free to use that. That's a concept which ticks a lot of the boxes. It's something original. I've not seen anything like that. And what it would also mean is that you've got infinite variety while following a very similar structure and format on every episode. Now, you don't have to use that idea. It just gives you an idea of something original and unique and giving a structured format while also having variety. And that's really what you're looking for in a podcast. And the final hack before we end today is to repurpose audio into video. So I generally record the audio when I do my podcasts. And it dawned on me that YouTube has a bigger global audience than Spotify. It's about 4 times as big. But I was only on Spotify and the podcast and not on YouTube as well. So I actually use an app called Pictory.ai, and that means that I can use my audio and my transcript to create video files. This is something recently I did for a Halloween-themed one, and you'll see here that I've got my QR code as a way to generate leads. I've got the transcript, I've got the themed video, and this is genuinely something that took me about 10 minutes to create this video from the audio once I've already done that. If I was doing short form, I would use Opus Clip, and this enables you to record your video footage and repurpose that into very short, snappy social media clips. And I use Sonics.ai for transcribing. So I would drop the MP3 into Sonics. That would give me a transcript. I then drop the transcript into Pictory, add the MP3, and then within about 10 minutes, that gives me a brand new YouTube video. And for YouTube, generally, you need a thumbnail image as well as the video. So I also use ChatGPT to generate the thumbnail images. And this is very, very efficient to do. It doesn't take very long, but it does mean that you can have a presence on video as well as the audio podcast. And the goal of this is to build an audience, to build a brand, and to generate new clients with people that would never have known about you were you not on the podcast. So this is my presentation. If you have any questions or compliments whatsoever, now is the time to give them. And I appreciate this is on YouTube. So if you have any questions or feedback, given that this is a practice presentation, feel free to put them in the comments. And if you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, subscribe. And if you're not subscribed to my podcast, do that as well. Thank you very, very much for watching today. And I'm going to stop the streaming. Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to The Hypnotist with Adam Cox, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. To automatically receive the latest episodes, please subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, please share this episode with just one friend you think it could help. And if this episode helped you, please leave us a 5-star review.